Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, writers, columnists, reporters, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, people who can form complete thoughts, complete sentences, interesting perspectives so that we can provide it to you, the public. We don't care what part of the agenda or sphere that they on, but we wanted to provide information directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that used to be cool when I was in high school. We're going to try to bring it back. Maybe it will be cool, maybe it won't. It's called thinking for yourself. I don't know. Maybe we'll have a renaissance. Maybe we won't. With us today is Seth Masket. He's a professor and he's the director of the Center on American Politics at Department of Political Science at Denver University. And he was a recommendation from Rosalind Cooperman. We want to say thank you to Rosalind Cooperman. Thank you very much, Professor Cooperman. We really appreciate your recommendation. Seth Masket is a professor of political science and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He's the author of Learning from Loss, the Democrats' 2016 to 2020, The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy, No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarized Legislatures, as well as co-author of a recent textbook on political parties. He studies political parties, campaigns, and elections, and state legislatures. He contributes regularly at Politico, Mischiefs of Faction, and the Denver Post. He is currently working on a book project examining the Republican Party's interpretations of the 2020 election and its preparations for 2024. PhD in political science from UCLA, great school. Political management, George Washington University, and political science at UC Berkeley. Very well educated, many different universities. A fantastic background with a great understanding of American government. And this was the book. We'll get into this a little bit. No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarize Legislatures. But first, I need to ask you, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to cover? Is there something else we need to talk about?
Everything sounded great, except I'm at the University of Denver, not Denver University. Although it goes
Thank
by
you.
DU. It's one of those.
Thank you. I was saying Bowdoin University for about 3 shows till someone goes, it's Bowden. I go, thanks. Two other professors let me just go Bowdoin throughout for an hour and then saying it. I'm like, thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. Well, let's talk about, I want to talk about the book, but let me start with the standard questions. Is political polarization an issue in America today? Or is it not? It's just kind of like dramatized and overblown, and we don't really need to worry about it. It's fine. Or is it a real issue and has been accelerating at a rapid pace in the last few years? Please answer both as an American with 2 working eyeballs and as a professional academic.
It's a real issue. I mean, polarization is real. I honestly don't know that it is the worst thing going on in U.S. politics, but it interacts with a lot of other problems we have that kind of makes things worse. One thing I'd say, if you look kind of at the history of the U.S., polarization is pretty normal. That is, we've had a 2-party system for a very long time. We've had the Democratic and Republican parties as those 2 major parties since the 1850s. And most of the time since then, honestly, there's been a pretty strong division between the 2, major splits between the 2, with a curious exception of this period from roughly the 1940s to the early 1980s. And, people who remember that period remember a time when the parties could get along easier, when Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could go for drinks after work and things like that, and look back fondly at that era. And honestly, there were a lot of problems with that era, and there were just a lot of historical weirdness that produced that era. So what we're experiencing now is in some ways a little more historically normal, even if it's very frustrating. But part of the problem is that, not every American is that polarized. There are a lot of people who find themselves sort of caught between the two parties, and find themselves not feeling adequately represented by them. They don't see themselves as either conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats, and they feel that they're dissatisfied with the choices they have to face at the ballots. And I think that is a real frustration that people
have. Had heard that before, that there was two parties. There's periods of polarization. Certainly, there was the lead up to the Civil War. Certainly, as I understand, there was a lot of friction after the Civil War in the 1890s. You can also go to the decision to go into World War I. You can also look at the riots against German immigrants somewhere around the same time. So certainly 1812, certainly there's periods where there was a lot of disagreement. Nobody stormed a Capitol. So that's different. Is it fair to say that because people stormed a Capitol, and we haven't seen that since 1812, and because we had a president who said, hey, let's deny that the other guy won the election. Hey, everybody, come on, let's just do that. And then a lot of people do that. And we have Joseph Biden go on television with a blood red backdrop at night, 2 active duty Marines, and seem to call out 78 million Americans as enemies of the state. Seen that before in the past, or this is new and scary?
I don't know that I would say we've not had anything between 1812 and today. There was actually quite a long period of violence directed against elected governments in the period after the Civil War, where you had, there was a city in North Carolina that was led by a legitimately elected coalition of white and black leaders, and essentially a group of white supremacists decided that that was unacceptable, and they took it over by force, and drove the elected leaders out of the city. We saw things like that in a number of places, largely in the South after the Civil War. We've had periods of domestic violence in this country's history. It happened a lot in the 1960s and 1970s. But yes, what happened after the 2020 election, what happened with the riots at the Capitol at January 6th really do stand out. And that's one of those things where polarization is not necessarily the one thing, but it contributes to it. So, if you have a party that is increasingly comfortable with using political violence to achieve its goals, it'd be one thing if we were in a less polarized era and a lot of more moderate voters would simply say, well, I find that unacceptable, and I don't want to, vote with a party that endorses that sort of thing. In a more polarized world, it's harder to do that because basically there's a lot of people who are, say, dissatisfied with a leader like Donald Trump, but they still see the Democrats as far worse, and so they'll be willing to support whatever Donald Trump does as long as they see the Democrats as worse. There are a lot of Democrats who might be dissatisfied with Joe Biden as a leader, but they still see the Republicans as far worse and far more ideologically distant, and so they'll accept whatever Democrats do as a result of that. So that's part of the problem with polarization, and particularly polarization in a two-party system, is that people will accept pretty much whatever their party does because it still looks better than whatever the other party is doing.
I've heard that, and I've heard that that's especially increased in comparison to the 1980s to now, that we used to people, I believe the term is effective polarization. I'm still learning all the terms and the correct way to use them while trying to understand the concepts. As I understand, it is basically we have differences between us, but I assume the differences between us are twice as big as they actually are. And because we're different, I assume that you're bad, your motives are bad, and you don't actually have morals behind your motives. And when we look at, I think it was Liliana Mason wrote a book where she said, there seems to be something hardwired into us to form in and out groups. This is my group. I'm part of this group. You're not part of my group. Therefore, you're part of a bad group because you're not part of my group. and there seems to be something to that. I wanted to ask you, one party's willing to use violence to achieve its goals. I mean, the Republican Party?
In the case of January 6th, yes.
Okay.
Now, I wouldn't say that's necessarily true solely Republicans throughout history by a long shot. But in that case, yes. And a large part of Republican leaders initially condemned that violence and then came around to either defending it or rationalizing it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're the first person that, I mean, people were aware of that, but I had to bring that up, that you had a lot of Republicans initially condemn January 6th, as they should have, but then walked it back as a party. I mean, that, for me, in my opinion, doesn't matter in this because I'm trying to interview people and the public needs to hear what the experts are saying. But for me, that was scarier than actually January 6th, because January 6th was horrible. I knew it was horrible. And then for people to go, no, that's not that bad. That blew my mind. I was like, were we looking at the same thing? It's like if you watch someone get murdered, that's horrible. And then somebody says, oh, that was bad. But then the next day they go, I really don't think murder's that bad. What are you talking about?
Yeah, particularly when we see the same people doing that. When we see like Speaker Kevin McCarthy, we heard yelling at Donald Trump on January 6th, we got to get this crowd out of here. Our lives are in danger. You see Josh Hawley, Senator, who we literally saw him running for his life, and then after cheering them on, and then later rationalizing the violence. That's an example of the sort of polarization we see, where it's people whose very lives were endangered by that violence then coming to rationalize because they still think it's better than the other party winning office.
What about, just to be fair, Joseph Biden says on TV, I want to punch Donald Trump in the face. What about when Maxine Waters, a famous Democrat, says, if you see Trump supporters anywhere, even if they're with their family and they're at dinner, you should get right up in their face and accost them? What about when Chris Cuomo was on CNN and he said, if you have a political disagreement with someone, it's okay to punch them in the face? And what about when Kamala Harris was on the Ellen DeGeneres show and joked about shooting Donald Trump in the head before she became elected as vice president? Are these examples of a party that might seem somewhat tolerant of violence?
I don't know that Kamala Harris example before. I hadn't heard of that, but
Ellen DeGeneres show. She said, basically, Donald Trump, someone else are in an elevator with you. And then she made a joke referencing The Godfather where she said, does one of us have to come out of line? It was a reference to the guy getting shot in the back of the head in The Godfather. And then everybody laughed on the Ellen DeGeneres show. She was not condemned for that and then was elected to the vice presidency, although that's a felony in the Constitution. None of these people were criticized for this on the left. Certainly, I think January 6th was horrible. I'm disgusted by it. Yeah. But isn't this also not great behavior for trying to calm the temperature down?
Oh, it's definitely not great behavior. And, definitely even, sort of offhanded comments that seem to excuse violence. They don't necessarily immediately cause the violence, but they contribute to a culture where violence is seen as more permissible. I think we're seeing it more on the right now than we've seen it on the left, but that doesn't mean that there's some Democratic officers who are, not willing to use that sort of rhetoric. They sometimes get punished for it. They sometimes get pulled aside, get disciplined for it. Generally, I think the Democrats are more squeamish about using that kind of language, but we do occasionally see people get heated. And people, particularly on the far left, sometimes say, well, the right's doing it, why can't we do it too? Which is part of the just perpetuates the cycle.
That sounds like children's reasoning, right? He's going around punching everybody, so I get to punch everybody. I remember my mom saying that doesn't make any sense and criticizing me when I use that logic as a 5-year-old. I certainly more on the right. But what bothers me is that the left saying, hey, the right's using violence, that's wrong. Okay, you can't even condemn your own side. That sends good signals to the public, like, hey, we're serious about not using violent language, although we occasionally use it ourselves. But we mean it when we criticize the other side for doing it. I remember AOC, after January 6th, literally went on the tweet and said, "You're trying to kill me. You're trying to kill me." And she used that as a thing until they found out she was never any real chance of danger. She wasn't even in the right place. She was far away. She was already secured. And then she was blaming, I think, Ted Cruz for attempting to kill her. That's not true. But she used that for political points. I mean, that's not good either, right?
I don't know that I would fault her in that particular circumstance. I have heard her use some pretty excited rhetoric, but there was literally a violent mob there gunning for her, and maybe they weren't, near her and in a position to do that. But there were people chanting her name, coming in with weapons, coming in with twist ties, and I can certainly hardly fault her for feeling like her life was being threatened in that moment.
Okay, there was some reviews saying that she was not near the danger zone and that her analysis didn't match up with what the security guards and the Secret Service at the time were saying. But we'll just move on.
Okay.
You talked about how polarization had happened in the past. It's happening now. Can we then say, don't worry, let it play out? It's been bad before. We've had these ups, we've had these downs. Just it'll be fine. It'll work itself out. Or, as some people have said, we might be approaching a level of polarization where things snap and they can't be put back together. Which one seems more accurate?
I worry, and my feelings on this are informed somewhat by Lily Mason's research that you referenced earlier, in that polarization is reinforced by a lot of different things right now. That is, we've had periods in the past where, there it is, where Democrats and Republicans just, vote against each other very strongly. There's a lot of party discipline. What makes today different is that those partisan identities overlap with a lot of other identities. We're increasingly polarized also by race, by economic class, by sexuality, by gender, by religion, by rural-urban divides, and those things just increasingly align with party identities, which means it just makes it a lot harder for there to be any bipartisan solutions at all. Added to that, you have the type of governing institutions that we have at the federal level. We have a system of government that is designed to be divided. It's designed to make it, challenging to govern. So in order for, any party to actually govern, well, they need to control a lot of different branches of government at the same time. There's, the Senate, the minority party has a lot of power through the filibuster and through other institutions that have developed over time. So those institutions tend to work pretty well when you have far less polarized parties than we have today. Today, it just simply makes it a lot harder to govern, a lot harder to get anything done. Plus, you have power shared with all these different, 50 different states, and then county level governments and city level governments. So we're in a situation where it's increasingly hard for the government to do much of anything, thanks to the level of polarization. I don't know that there will be an official moment when things snap. But we may have already passed that moment, actually, and it was more of a soft snap. But we are in a situation where things are not functioning particularly well, and we're having a hard time addressing the most serious challenges that the country faces. I think we're in need of some kind of reform. Now, what that might look like is a whole other story, whether we simply need to, come up with less polarized parties than we currently have, or whether we need to add more parties into the mix, or come up with some other ways of doing this. But we're in a bit of a governing crisis right now as a result of all this.
So everything isn't just fine. The ship isn't just sailing just fine. We, in fact, have well, we don't need to like jump up and down it like we're crazy, but the ship we're on has structural problems. There are real significant structural issues the way the ship was built. That's, it worked before, but we're kind of too polarized right now for it to work, and it seems to just be shutting down. It used to be, it was difficult to get things passed. There was a system of checks and balances, and that was to make sure the best ideas got boiled to the top. Now there's so many checks and balances, nothing gets boiled to the top. We just shut everything down. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's that,
Roughly,
roughly,
roughly.
that we have a governing system that um, doesn't function well with strong parties, and we're that's roughly what I'm saying there.
I saw some people who had said, let's see, snap. I saw some people who had said George W. Bush, not popularly elected president. Donald Trump, not popularly elected president. Brett Kavanaugh, not popular, appointed. Amy Coney Barrett, not popular, appointed. And what they're pointing out is the systems in the Constitution. We did an interview with, he was the dean of the Annenberg School of Communication out of USC, and he goes, yeah, there's problems baked into the Constitution. So you have states are rewarded, not necessarily people. And that's why I was really interested in talking to you, because you are a director of the Center on American Government. Some people are saying there's problems baked directly into the Constitution, which make us become less democratic. So you have states get 2 senators. One state's tiny, and other states could be gigantic. Doesn't matter. We get equal representation. So California only gets 2 senators no matter what. There's about 35 to 40 tiny little states with small populations. They almost own half the Senate, or they do. We can also look at the Electoral College, and yeah, you get more votes if you're a larger state, but really given the scheme, some smaller states get a lot of representation. And then if you look at the fact that the Senate can control who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, and they also can control what laws get passed, it looks like little states with small populations have an outsized influence to shut things down. The term that was used out here in California, I didn't make it up, was tyranny of the minority. I didn't make it up. What they're talking about is a majority of the population lives on the coast. So what? A majority of the states said, we don't like what you liked, and we're going to vote for this instead. And we get what we want because of the Constitution. We get outsized influence because of the Senate and the selection of the Supreme Court justices, and then influence on the presidency, et cetera. And so that's why we have these presidents who get elected twice that the people didn't want. And that's why we have a Supreme Court that seems to be more conservative than what the American people want. Any truth to this? Problems baked into the Constitution giving inordinate power to small states, even though they don't reflect a reasonable size of the population?
No, that's a real issue. And that's what, we sometimes call like a democratic deficit. The Constitution has a number of very democratic features to it, particularly the House of Representatives, which is, really designed to represent the people most directly, and, kind of be their voice. People are directly elected every 2 years. Districts are roughly equal in size. There's also some sort of anti-democratic or less democratic features of the Constitution, which can include the Senate, where every state has equal number of senators, no matter how big or small they are. The Electoral College, which is tilted somewhat in that direction because of the Senate. The Supreme Court, there's essentially once people are in, there's no real democratic accountability for justices. Now, that was seen as like a solid compromise at the time in 1787, because there were concerns about excesses of democracy. You don't want things to be tilted one way too much or the other. So this was a compromise. This was a balance.
Sure.
The concern of that today is that some of those less democratic features are tilted toward one party rather than the other. That is, the Electoral College, the Senate have always had something of a rural bias. meaning that people from rural states tend to get more representation than those from urban states. You have smaller populations in places like Montana and the Dakotas and just large rural states and Wyoming, and who have the same number of senators as people from California do, even though there's a lot more of them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, the rural bias is one thing, but in recent decades, the rural bias has come to mean a Republican bias. It wasn't always that way. For a long time, Democrats had a bias in that direction. But today it means that, those large rural states tend to be more Republican. It tends to mean that Democrats need more votes in order to win control of the Senate than Republicans would. It tends to mean that Democrats need more votes to win the presidency than Republicans would, which is why we occasionally see these things like we saw in 2000, like we saw in 2016, where a Republican can win the White House without winning a majority of the votes cast for president out there. And that's built into the Constitution. That's perfectly constitutional. But if that happens a lot, it tends to undermine support for the whole enterprise. It tends to undermine people's faith in democracy. And that is a real area of concern.
People I have found don't understand the Constitution well, don't know how laws are passed, don't understand how the government works. All they hear is beacon of freedom and democracy. So when they get someone who they didn't vote for, they think the whole thing's broken, is what I see. That's just my impression. I'm not basing that on a study. That's just my impression of folks, is because there's always this debate on direct democracy or representative democracy. They don't know the difference. So they're like, I voted for this guy and everybody else did too. Why is he not the person? I don't. And they just think it's broken. And you try to go, well, you did this and it voted to this person and they did that and it voted here. And so see, it's really fair. That goes nowhere. They're just like, we all voted for person X. They were super popular. We didn't get them. What's going on? They don't have this in Europe. What are we doing here? So I understand. And I try to go, look, it's baked into the system. This is the enlightened beacon on a hill since the 1700s that we talked about. A perfect form of government, never before seen since the ancient Greeks. Remember, this is it, right? Leap into the faith. The most brilliant men in the world, the founding fathers. Let me ask you another question, if I can. Mm-hmm. This is from Norman Ornstein. I'm sorry. I apologize about that, Professor. Norman Ornstein is a professional demographer. So he works in demographics, looking at population changes, and he based his analysis on the United States Census. He's well-respected, good professors, written a lot of books with other professors, so he's not a crazy guy. This is somewhat makes sense. Other people have said this. From Norman Ornstein. I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of Americans will choose 70 senators, and the 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, and more male than the 70%. Unsettling to say the least. What he's saying is that the things that happened with Trump and Bush and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, it's only going to get worse for the next 20 years, roughly until the census says that we have a majority integrated voter population. So we have more minority babies born now, but they're not voters. By the time we actually get to where there's more minority voters, not babies, will be somewhere around this time, around 2040, or when NASA said we'll have a working colony on Mars. I'm not exaggerating. So, he's saying, hey, you got these 35 states, 40 states, the population doesn't live there. We've talked to some other people, and it's not necessarily anyone's fault. Young people want to go to the big cities. It's exciting. Minorities want to go to the big cities. Minorities also realize Trump did well there. They're a little bit scared of the area. Immigrants are now a little bit scared of the area. And so what you have is this strain of it's all white, all rural, all Fox News watching, no young people, no minorities, no LGBTQ, nobody to challenge their thinking, and they're kind of isolated to themselves. And they already took 2 presidencies. And this will continue till America's a majority minority voter population. Is he wildly off, or is this something that could get worse as we go over the next 2 decades?
He's not wildly off. I mean, I'm always a little hesitant to, project exactly how populations are going to shift around and
Of
how
course,
those populations will align in terms of parties, because people do shift around.
of course,
But
of course.
uh, but the basic problem is there. I mean, if you just think of just sort of urbanization is just an ongoing phenomenon throughout U.S. history. And if you can imagine, just to sort of draw out to its logical extreme, if, ultimately like a little over half the country is living in just California and New York State, and those tend to be more Democratic populations, well, you'll still have a mostly Democratic country, but the Democrats will basically get 4 seats in the Senate, and everywhere else becomes just like very red. So yeah, that presents a problem for representation. One thing that, and then, again, that is consistent with the Constitution.
Right,
Um,
right,
but
right, right.
we see in a lot of other democracies that there's quite a number of other representative democracies that have two-chambered representation like we do. They have some version of a House and a Senate. You think of the United Kingdom, which has a House of Commons and a House of Lords. What they have the sense to do is that their House of Lords has almost no power, right? This is, an upper class, less representative chamber, but they don't have very much direct power over actual legislation. That's largely a ceremonial post. We're one of very few representative democracies where the upper chamber actually has basically equal, if not more power than the House of Representatives. They have all sorts of appointment power. They can really gum up legislation if they don't like it. And there's the filibuster and all sorts of other things. So it's possible that we can still have some of these less democratic traditions, but we don't have to give them the quite amount of power that they currently have.
I've heard that. I've heard reforms on the Electoral College, reforms on the Senate. This is the question that I have. I go to 35 states. Let's say I'm elected president, President Ruiz, and I go to 35 states and I go, look, I know that you guys have had a lot of power for 2 centuries, but for the good of the country, I want you to agree to a system that basically permanently neuters you to where we can kind of effectively ignore anything you have to say. But it's the good of America. 35 states, come on, guys, agree to this. Is that realistic?
No, but you don't need to necessarily get the approval of all the states to change some of the powers and the scope of powers that the Senate has. A lot of that can be done just by congressional changes in D.C. Now, of course, you have to get a majority of the Senate to agree to these sorts of things, which in itself can be challenging. But that's you don't necessarily need the permission of every state to limit its own power.
Fair, but we couldn't change the 2 senators per state, right, without the 35 states agreeing. Or am I getting that wrong?
That's just you're not going to change that, the 2 senators per state, without like a major redrafting of the Constitution.
And
that's just baked in there.
Right, and we couldn't change the fact that the Senate is an equal house in power to the people's house without 35 states agreeing, roughly.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And we couldn't agree that to, kind of get rid of the Electoral College or do something more balanced without 35 states agreeing.
Well, there is a reform that's been floating around for a little while now to, essentially have the popular vote take over for the presidency. It's the I'm not remembering the precise name of it. I think it's the National Voter Compact. And the idea is you get state legislatures to agree to award their electors to whoever won the popular vote.
Right.
And the Interstate Voter Compact is the name of it, excuse me. And once you have enough states to form a majority of the Electoral College who've agreed to do this, in theory, you've fixed that problem without needing to amend the Constitution and without getting everyone to sign off on it. The problem is, I think, the follow through. I mean, there might be some questions as to its constitutionality. There might be some questions as to whether, if a state has signed on to this, would they actually agree to do that? Would a legislature agree to, if their state voted for Joe Biden, would they actually agree to vote for Donald Trump if Donald Trump won the popular vote, or vice versa? And that gets a little, I don't know what the enforcement would look like there.
Right, because if you're not doing, big changes that go all the way down through the paperwork, and you're kind of doing surface agreements, they can kind of go, I think with the electoral college electors or whatever, you can say, I know the people want this person, but I feel in my heart it's this other person. I saw that happen in the election. They go, I just feel in my heart that I should not place my vote for who everyone around me is saying, even though I'm a representative. And because they didn't sign a law locking them in. It was kind of just a general gentleman's agreement. So you could have 35 states say to that, but would they be held to it when time counts? Also, you still got to get, as I understand, those 35 states to agree to this, at least the majority of the states to agree to, hey, we're all going to start awarding our electors to whoever wins the popular vote. That still requires them to say that they're going to give up power to someone else. Like if you're 35 states who are red and you're in the center, you know who's going to win the popular vote. It's going to be a lefty liberal candidate in the next election. And you're going, well, we'll sort of allow ourselves to, I hope. Let me ask you about the split between the American public. I think you acknowledge this, a rural-urban split. Some people have said that the American people are sorted into different groups. And they're talking about something called the Big Sort, going back to the 1990s. And they're saying that we are very geographically sorted. Here's the map. This comes from the New York Times. And it's based upon a book that came out earlier by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, basically saying Americans are moving themselves into ideologically similar communities, whether they're doing that consciously or unconsciously, but it does seem to be happening. This is looking at what are called landslide election counties. So this is a map of presidential elections at the county level, and these are landslide election counties. So the map in the top left, the one in the top left is 1990. I'm sorry, I know it's a little bit small, but the one in the top left is 1992. Red means don't even run here if you're not a Republican. Republicans win by 20 percentage points or more. So there's no chance for anybody else. Blue means don't even run here if you're not a Democrat. Democrats win by 20 percentage points more. There's no chance for you winning. Gray means, though, it's competitive. Sometimes they vote for John McCain. Sometimes they want to elect President Barack Obama. If you scroll all the way down, directly underneath the top left map, you scroll down to the map at the bottom. It's really big. That's 2016. And what you can see is that almost all the gray has been wiped out. And we've gone from at least half the country used to have competitive elections to almost none. And the 2020 map seems to continue that. I'm in one of the few, apparently, last competitive regions, the Central Valley. Republicans and Democrats win here by about like 2 percentage points. Like, hey, I won 52% of the vote. And then the next guy comes or a woman, and they get 52% of the vote. So we do seem to fluctuate between both parties somewhat evenly. It caught me off guard that we were one of the last competitive districts, but this looks like people have sorted themselves out since 1992. And people are pointing at this to explain Trump and Bush. Is the big sort happening? Is it not? Is there a rural-urban divide? Has it gone on for decades? Is this a problem? Or, as one professor did it, I reject these maps. Americans are united. What are we to believe? I'm not a professor.
I mean, this is useful in some ways to think about when you're talking about polarization. That can mean a lot of different things, right? There's a polarization where, we're increasingly becoming more ideologically divided from other people. And, there's a polarization that, where just the parties are moving further apart, but that doesn't necessarily mean people are. It's important to distinguish between these maps, which are very real, and also what's going on at individual levels. But some version of this sorting has been happening. People are increasingly mobile. They can choose other areas to live, either because of job opportunities or school, or they like the neighborhoods where they want to raise kids or anything else. And people move. Some research I've been impressed with over the years has said that people often move not necessarily for political reasons, but that those reasons do tend to overlap with politics anyway. So you might find someone who just wants to live in a walkable neighborhood that has easy access to sushi and good coffee. Well, it turns out that's probably a Democrat, right? Or someone might want to move to a neighborhood that's more spread out, where you can have bigger lawns and more space from your other neighbors. That person's probably a Republican, but they're not necessarily planning to just live with other people who vote like they do. That just kind of pans out that way. And so we tend to see that more and more over time. What's interesting recently is that you have state and local policies increasingly differ by, depending on who lives there and where people live. So, up until recently, you could move around and it wouldn't necessarily affect your day-to-day life all that much. Increasingly, where you live means whether or not you'll have access to abortion, whether or not you can easily purchase a gun, what your taxes will look like, what your roads will look like, whether there'll be food inspectors hired by the county, whether there'll be healthcare available, all sorts of things that overlap with that. So people are, increasingly, I think, being forced to make choices based on those things, based on what kind of life they want to live as they decide where they're going to live. I'm hearing from more and more students who are thinking about, going to colleges and thinking about, well, they've just ruled out certain parts of the country because they don't like the laws that are being passed there now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that will affect things for generations to come. They will decide where they're going to settle and raise families and things like that. And, it's going to have a, very long-term effects on this country. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily horrible in itself. Like, it's okay to have a large country where people, choose to live near people who think like them. That doesn't necessarily undermine a country, but it does make it harder when we have to reach national decisions on things. It just means, we are more polarized, and we increasingly don't come into contact with people who think differently from we do.
If this has been going on since the 1990s, and if, yes, gerrymandering had a part, and social media had a part, and extreme politicians had a part, but they seem to be exacerbating an underlying trend that goes back before all those things, where people just say, I don't want to live with you guys. I want to live over here. And I've seen what you're talking about. Are they consciously saying, I need to live where there's a bunch of Republicans who vote? Probably not. Are they taking other cues and then they move, and it tends to be their political philosophy, and they sort of generally start voting the way their neighbors do, although they don't necessarily have conscious political conversation? That seems more apt. But if this is true, this has been going on for 3 decades, and it's resulting in 2 different presidencies and Supreme Court justices. How do we undo this? How do we wind this clock back and get this 100 to 150 million people to go back to diverse neighborhoods? And can we do that in about a year or two? Or is this a, hey, I got to ask the questions, because when I read the newspapers, what they say is this. Let me show you, if I may. Oh yeah, we got polarization, but it's because of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering came online technically in 2000. It wasn't a problem until 2010. Social media wasn't really a problem until 2015, 2017. This is according to political historians. Extreme politicians came out the last 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency. So the big sort predates all these things by 15 to 20 years. How do we
Well,
undo this?
I mean, just to clarify on that, I mean, gerrymandering's been going on as long as we've had districts, right? People have always been like, looking for some advantage when they're doing redistricting. What these maps that you have up right now are showing nicely that, this is counties. Counties have not changed their borders for the most part. But people are just moving into places and voting more like the people who they're living around. This isn't something that we just change. We're not going to force Democrats to go live near other Republicans and vice versa. One thing that we could change is, we could try and change the number of parties that we have in this country. There are increasingly parts of the country that are experimenting with versions of which you might call proportional representation. There's I think 9 states that have legislatures with multi-member districts. That is where you have one district that has 3, 4, or 5 members elected from it. You have some cities that have elections that way. If that is expanded and you can combine that with some sort of ranked choice voting or something else, you can get a situation where you have other parties vying for control. And maybe we don't have a 3, 4, 5 party system like you see in a number of European countries overnight, but you could have a system where some more minor parties get more votes, where people come to see that if a party gets 20% of the vote, they could get 20% of the seats in the state legislature. So maybe it is worth my time to vote for a small party that isn't going to win outright. That can contribute somewhat to maybe a less polarized environment where people can vote for a party that more reflects them, but the cost of another party winning doesn't seem quite so dire because there's lots of other choices in there, because there's more floating coalitions going on in there. And so you would still have a situation where liberals are living near other liberals in very urban counties, and conservatives are living near conservatives in very rural counties. But they don't necessarily have to hate each other. And it doesn't necessarily have to overlap with intense partisanship. You can still see more creative governing going on and more creative coalitions being formed and reformed over time.
I think what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we look at most of the modern democracies in the world, they don't actually follow the American system of winner take all. They have a multi-party system where people elect parties. All parties at least get some representation, and you have what's called a governing coalition, where a collection of parties comes together to have over majority, and then they will govern the system. And it seems a lot more stable, and they'll typically have ranked choice voting. So if you vote for a party, you at least get some representation. There's not, we voted, well, you lost, you get nothing at all. And it surprises me that most of the world's democracies follow that system, which is not like the American system. And that when America tried to install democracies in Afghanistan and Iraq, we didn't even put in our own system. We put in this other system. So it seems like we're the odd man out on that. So that's what you're getting at. And we could possibly make that work here. I know Andrew Yang is trying to make a third party. I know the Libertarian parties out there. They had Gary Johnson once. They seem to be going a little bit okay. Ross Perot. And you could also talk about Bernie Sanders' People's Party. These would be examples of a potential third party.
Maybe, but this is one thing where I think we've gotten things a little backwards. There actually are some viable minor parties going on at the local level in different parts of the country right now. And I think oftentimes what we see, people who want political change is they try and start it from the top, and it almost never works at that level. We saw Ross Perot try to do that with his own party in 1992. We see Andrew Yang trying to do that with his Forward Party. There's been a few groups who've tried to do that. It just basically start at the presidency. And that rarely catches on. But in Santa Monica, California, you have this group called Santa Monicans for Rent Control. I think if I have that right. And they have a lot of influence in local elections there in the city council and in some county offices and things like that. You have the progressives in Dane County and in Madison, Wisconsin, that have a lot of influence in local elections there. You have this kind of libertarian movement going on in New Hampshire, where they're trying to get people to move to the state, this free state movement there. I think if the country's electoral systems became more open to minor parties, I think a lot of those would maybe bubble up more from the local level and have more of an interesting effect in different regions of the country rather than being imposed from the top down.
I like that. That's the first solution I've ever heard like that. I like that. That's the first time. And I love the fact that you have a background, center on American government and politics. That's great. That's an innovative. See, folks, I learn something new every time we do this. Yeah, well, you saw the maps. Is there any questions you had for us? Is there anything you wanted to go more in detail on? Something you didn't get to express? A question you had, a topic you wanted to make sure to cover? I know, the book.
Yeah, we can talk about the book quickly, although I should go shortly. But
okay, yes, Professor. We'll do the book very briefly, and I appreciate your time. Okay. What is this book about? What is it saying? What does no middle ground mean? And why is political machines, why are they fueling partisanship?
So the puzzle that kind of animated this book in the first place is I was studying and living in California at the time. California was kind of a fascinating place in that it does, on paper, it has some of like the weakest political parties in the country. The political parties there, they don't have very big budgets. They don't have much staff. There's not much they can actually do in elections. But you also have some of the most polarized parties in the country there. You have, very, very liberal Democrats in the state legislature, very conservative Republicans. And I was kind of curious, how that happens. Like, who's sending these very polarized people into government in the first place? And so I spent a fair amount of time just traveling to different communities around the state and interviewing people who are involved with local party nominations there, get involved in primaries and things like that. Talk to mostly Black Democratic activists in South Central LA. Spoke to mostly Latino folks in the eastern part of LA County. Spent a fair amount of time interviewing folks in Fresno and the Central Valley. Talked to folks in Orange County and San Francisco, and got this sense of actually pretty interesting, what I call informal party organizations. These kind of local party networks, usually networks of some pretty powerful and wealthy donors, working with interest groups, sometimes with churches, and sometimes with some local office holders. And, them being kind of the acknowledged political bosses in their regions. Mm-hmm. That if you want to run for office as a Democrat in South LA, you need to go and ask Maxine Waters and the people who are closely aligned with her if you can do that, if you'll get her support. And if you don't have her support, it's really hard to win the Democratic nomination. And if you want to win as a Republican in Orange County, it helps if you have the support of these like mostly real estate people who are operating in the Lincoln Club in Orange County. And if you don't have their backing, it's really hard to win a Republican nomination. And you see these sorts of things going on all throughout the state. And so these folks are acting in some ways like less formal political machines, but they really are the gatekeepers to office. And one thing that they want is they do not want moderates. They want people who will vote the party line. They want people who will push an ideological agenda. And they make it just very hard for moderates to win office. So I found that whole story fascinating. And I tried to work that out through a combination of a lot of like qualitative evidence, doing a lot of interviews and history there, but also some quantitative stuff and measuring the impact of these people's endorsements and when they support people in terms of campaign finance, and just see how that influences primary elections.
Professor, I'm sorry, I have to confront you here. I've heard that primaries make us have to elect extreme people. We have no choice. The primaries do it. The primary system's all bad. If it was gone, everything would snap back into place. It's all primaries. That's the whole problem. Now I'm hearing from you, well, it's the gatekeepers won't even allow you to have a, what am I to believe? You're saying something opposite from what I've heard other smart people say. No, it's the primaries. The primaries force people to get extreme people. If we just got rid of the primaries, everything gets fixed. Sounds like you're saying something else.
I mean, there's always going to be some sort of screening mechanism to decide who gets to be on the ballot. And generally, there's people who are very interested in political outcomes. There are people who are just very organized, and they'll try and screen people out, right? They'll try and screen people out who are not going to push an agenda that they care about. And maybe primaries, primaries were come up with as a system to get around the party bosses in the first place 100 years ago. But party bosses are clever, and they figure out ways to control things. And so they've come up with ways of gaming who can get into the primaries and who will win in those. Come up with another system, they'll eventually figure that one out too.
That's the second time I got educated today. So I didn't know. That's the second thing. I try to study this. I've read all this.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
I didn't know. But I haven't heard anybody else say that. Going, hey, because it seems a primary system. We'll just, they're looking for a boogeyman. And you go, well, hold on. Maybe there's a little bit more to this. Thank you. I didn't know that before. I want to say thank you for coming out. I appreciate that. I did want to show you one thing if I can. This is the AOC to Ted Cruz. You almost had me murdered. That wasn't true at all. This is the Kamala Harris on the Ellen DeGeneres show talking about executing Donald Trump. So I just wanted to provide some.
Okay, that was 2018. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide some citations. Yeah. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate all your time. Let me ask you two questions. I know you got to go. Number one, you're not you. You're not me. You're a third person. You don't know who this person is. They're watching the interview. They thought you did great. A lot of material. It's a week later. They're struggling to remember all the points. And they're going, wow, that was an interesting interview. I can't remember it all, but there was this one thing the professor said, and I can't get it out of my head, and it's 5 days later. What would that one thing be that you want this random person to not be able to forget 5 days from now? It's a stumper.
Yeah, we covered a lot of topics there, but I guess I would like them to think about how representation works in this country, in terms of like the Senate, in terms of the Supreme Court, in terms of everything else that the Constitution has designed, and just be willing to engage with the idea that things can be perfectly constitutional and still not be very democratic. And that there might be ways to change that. That there might be ways to accentuate the more democratic sides of our constitutional system and de-emphasize the less democratic side of things without necessarily needing to toss the whole thing in the wastebasket.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations? I hope you found that this wasn't gotcha journalism. We let you say your piece. We didn't try to attack you or filter what you said. Is there anybody that you know who might be willing to be part of honest conversation? You don't have to, but we always ask.
If you haven't had a chance to talk to him, and this is a fellow I've co-authored with quite a bit, is Hans Knoll at Georgetown University. He gives a very good interview and is very smart on these issues.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I will email you a copy of the video shortly, and I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. We really appreciate your time and your information.
Good talking to you. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Take care.